The pen trembled in her hand, long before her heart admitted anything was ending. Rain pressed against the glass outside the mediation office, blurring the city into soft, colorless shapes. Mara Ellison sat very still, a thin stack of papers before her, the kind that closed a life without ever mentioning love. In the hallway, someone laughed young, careless, and the sound cut through her like a draft. She didn't cry, she didn't move, she just pressed her thumb to the page where her name waited, as if touching it might bring back the woman she used to be. Across the room, her ex-husband checked his watch, already impatient to leave, already halfway in another life. And outside, his new partner sat in their shared car, scrolling her phone, not knowing or caring that 22 years were dissolving upstairs. The strange part wasn't the divorce. It was the quiet, the way a life could end without noise, without apology, without anyone noticing the woman at the center of it was slowly coming undone. If you've ever held a moment so long, it finally broke in your hands. This story may feel familiar. Let's begin. The pen shook only once right before Mara Ellison pressed it to the final line. After that, her hand was steady, almost too steady, as if the weight of those 22 years had already lifted off her wrist. The mediation office was silent, except for the faint hum of the rain tapping against the tall windows. The room smelled of coffee that had gone cold hours ago, and the fluorescent lights above flickered in a tired rhythm, as if even they were exhausted by the scene unfolding beneath them. She slid the papers toward the mediator, a middle-aged woman with soft eyes who had tried, twice, to catch Mara's gaze in some gesture of human comfort. Mara didn't meet it. She couldn't. Not yet. Maybe not today at all. Across from her, Evan had already pushed his chair back. He didn't check the documents. He didn't say a word. He simply reached for his coat with the eagerness of a man who had somewhere else to be, someone else to be with. His impatience filled the room louder than any argument they used to have. His eyes brushed past Mara, quick, almost apologetic, but not enough to mean anything. "So that's it," he muttered, as if the silence needed breaking. She nodded once. She couldn't trust her voice to do any better. He hesitated near the door. For a moment, she wondered if a memory might flicker across his face, something warm or human or shared. A Thanksgiving they'd hosted. The night Emily took her first steps. The hundreds of ordinary evenings when they'd fallen asleep in the same bed. Anything. But nothing came. "Well," he said, clearing his throat, "I should go." He didn't wait for a response. The door clicked shut behind him, soft but sharp enough to feel like a paper cut. Mara sat for another long second, staring at the empty chair he'd left behind. 22 years reduced to a hollow rectangle of worn leather and the faint warmth his body had left on its surface. She wondered if that warmth would fade quickly, the way affection had, quietly, gradually, without either of them noticing until it was gone. The mediator walked her to the elevator, speaking in the gentle voice people use around grieving individuals. Mara barely registered the words. Something about mailing copies. Something about finalizing. Mara murmured thank you and stepped inside the elevator alone. Her reflection wavered in the brushed steel walls. 38, still young, people would say. Still time. Still room for reinvention. But inside, she didn't feel young. She felt erased, as if she'd spent years sanding herself down to fit into a marriage that gradually required less and less of her until she became almost invisible. Maybe that was her mistake, becoming too easy, too quiet, too careful not to disturb anything. Outside, the rain greeted her with a cold, insistent drizzle. She tightened her coat around herself and held her small tote close. It was pitifully light a notebook, a scarf her mother had knitted years ago, and the keys to the apartment she would need to vacate by the weekend. Everything else stayed with Evan. She didn't fight him for any of it. She hadn't had the strength. She spotted his car at the curb, a charcoal SUV she once loved driving. Now it looked foreign, wrong. A younger woman sat in the passenger seat, blonde hair in a high ponytail, scrolling through her phone with perfect nonchalance. Mara had seen her twice before, once by accident. once when the truth became unavoidable. The woman looked up just long enough to glance at Mara before returning to her screen, expressionless. Evan opened the driver's door without looking back, as if even meeting Mara's eyes would complicate the story he had already rewritten in his head. Mara stepped aside to let him pass. She forced her breathing to stay even. Stay quiet? Stay invisible? He brushed past her, pausing only long enough to say, "Try not to make this harder than it needs to be." The words landed heavier than he probably intended. They always did. She absorbed them without flinching, without replying, without letting her face move even a fraction. If she opened her mouth now, she wasn't sure what would come out, the truth or the scream she'd kept buried for years. Evan slid into the car, the door shut. The SUV pulled away, its tires hissing softly across the wet pavement. Mara didn't watch it go. Instead, she pulled her hood up and began walking down the sidewalk, letting the rain soak into the edges of her sleeves. The city blurred around her in shades of gray, neon reflecting in puddles like fractured memories. People passed her with umbrellas and quick strides, each of them carrying more purpose in their step than she felt in her entire body. She reached the end of the block and paused beneath a small awning. Her breath trembled in her chest, not quite a sob, not quite steady. Something in between, something unnamed. The rain was falling harder now, tapping a relentless rhythm on the metal awning above her. She closed her eyes, not because she needed a moment, but because she didn't know what direction to take next, not on this street, not in her life. A lump formed in her throat as the truth settled deeper. There was no home to go back to, no warm kitchen light waiting for her, no familiar hum of the house she'd lived in for half her adult life. Just this rain, this street, this silence. Her phone buzzed in her pocket. She didn't pull it out. She knew it wasn't Evan. He had already moved on, and she doubted it was Emily. Their daughter had taken her father's side without even realizing it, repeating words she must have heard from him. For now, Mara couldn't bring herself to see what the message said. She wasn't ready for anyone else's version of the truth. She stepped back toward the street as the bus approached the corner, splashing water up onto the curb. The headlights blurred through the rain, casting long streaks of light across her shoes. She took one deep breath, then another, trying to summon the courage to move, but her feet stayed rooted to the ground, as if some invisible thread held her there, in that moment between the life she had just left and whatever waited ahead. And still, she didn't answer Evan's final words, not because she couldn't, but because she no longer understood why she should. The bus was late. Of course it was. Everything Mara depended on lately seemed to arrive late or not at all. She stood beneath the small plexiglass shelter on the corner of Pine and 12th, a thin curtain of rain drifting sideways across the pavement. The bench inside was damp, a shallow puddle collected in its center, forcing her to remain standing. Her tote brushed against her leg with each shift of weight, the fabric softening as the rain slowly soaked through. The schedule posted behind the fog glass had blurred into unreadable smudges. She tried wiping the condensation with her sleeve, but the mist returned before she could make out the times. A light breeze carried the smell of wet asphalt and pine needles, making the whole street feel like fall had arrived a month ahead of schedule. She drew a slow breath. This small corner of Seattle had never seemed so wide, so indifferent. Cars passed in quick bursts of color, red taillights, silver reflections, the occasional splash from an impatient driver. People walking by didn't glance at her. She didn't blame them. She barely felt visible to herself. Her phone buzzed in her coat pocket. She hesitated before pulling it out, bracing herself for a message she wasn't sure she had the strength to see. When she unlocked the screen, the name made her chest tighten. Emily. Her daughter's text was short, written with the careless efficiency of someone young and too honest. "Dad said you were dramatic today. Are you okay?" Mara's throat closed. She stared at the words until they doubled. A drop of rain slid from her hood onto the screen, distorting the message for half a second. Dramatic. That was the story Evan had chosen to tell their daughter. She typed a reply. "I'm fine, sweetheart. Just a long day." She deleted it. She tried again. "There's more to it. Emily, Maybe when you're home, we can talk. She deleted that too. A third attempt. I miss you. Delete. The empty message box felt heavier than anything she could have typed. She didn't know how to reach Emily without sounding like she wanted to pull her away from her father, and she refused to do that, not after everything else had already crumbled. The rain thickened, a fine spray clung to her hairline, trickling down the back of her neck. She tucked her chin deeper into her collar, wishing the bus would finally appear so she could sink into its anonymous warmth. The idea of sitting among strangers suddenly felt like mercy. A car rolled past, its tires whispering along the wet street, and, without warning, a memory surfaced sharp. Unwelcome. Last Thanksgiving. Evan had been telling their guests about a business opportunity he was chasing. Something big, he'd said. A chance to buy into a partnership with a firm he admired. He'd been animated, proud, the wine in his glass catching the light. Mara had looked at the numbers earlier that week, quietly, carefully. She had voiced concerns gently, she thought. She'd expected a conversation, maybe even appreciation. Instead, he'd laughed, loud enough that the whole table paused. Mara worries about everything, he'd said, arm around her shoulders, squeezing her in a way that felt like both affection and restraint. She thinks every deal is going to fall apart. It's adorable. Adorable. Guests chuckled, eager to smooth over the awkwardness. Mara had smiled too, though it felt like her face didn't quite belong to her. Later, while clearing plates, her sister had whispered, "He didn't mean it, he's just excited." But the sting lingered for days. Standing at the bus shelter now, Mara felt the same warm flush of humiliation rise to her cheeks. Despite the cold air, she wiped a hand across her face, frustrated with herself. Why couldn't she stop replaying moments that had already taken enough from her? The rain eased slightly, turning to a soft patter. A couple walked by, holding a single umbrella, talking in low voices. Mara watched them until they disappeared around the corner, their closeness like a distant memory she didn't know how to access anymore. She checked her phone again. No new message from Emily. Maybe her daughter was in class. Maybe she didn't know what to say. Maybe she didn't want to choose sides. Or, Mara thought quietly, maybe Emily only ever heard Evan's version of her. That thought unsettled her more than the rain. Headlights swept across the wet pavement, and she straightened instinctively, expecting the bus. But the vehicle approaching wasn't a bus at all. It was a sleek black sedan, its paint reflecting the storefront lights like polished stone. The car slowed as it neared the shelter, its engine barely audible, too smooth, too clean to be an older model or a rideshare. It came to a full stop right in front of her. Mara stiffened. Cars didn't pull up to bus shelters unless they were lost or looking for someone. The tinted back window didn't roll down. The driver didn't gesture. The engine hummed with an expensive quietness that made her uneasy. She glanced behind her, half expecting to see someone else waiting. The shelter was empty. No one was approaching from either side of the street. The sedan remained still, as if studying her. The rain streaked thin silver lines down the windows. Mara's breath caught, a tightness forming low in her chest. Surely they weren't here for her. No one even knew where she was, not today. Not at this hour, not in this state. And yet, the car waited. She felt the urge to step back, to blend into the foggy glass behind her, but her legs wouldn't move. The city around her seemed to quiet, the sounds softening as though the rain itself was listening. The driver's door opened. A man stepped out, tall, dressed in a dark coat that looked tailored even in the rain. He closed the door gently, not slamming it, and walked toward her with a calm, deliberate pace. Mara's pulse quickened. She clutched her tote harder. When he stopped a few feet away, he didn't speak at first. He simply looked at her steady, searching like he'd come for a reason she couldn't yet imagine. And on the day she most wanted to disappear, someone had found her. He stepped out with the precision of someone trained to never waste a movement. Even in the wet streetlight glow, the lines of his gray coat fell clean and deliberate, the fabric barely shifting in the breeze. Mara felt her breath stall, some instinct tightening the muscles along her spine. The man wasn't rushing. He wasn't lost. He knew exactly where he was and exactly why he had come. "Mara Ellison," he asked. Her name sounded louder than the rain, cutting through the hush around the bus shelter. She straightened, fingers gripping the strap of her tote. "Who are you?" she said, trying to keep her voice steady. "A man who's been trying to reach you," he replied. His tone was even respectful, almost, but there was something underneath it, something that reminded her of airport security lines and people who walked like they belonged behind closed doors. She shook her head. "I'm not interested in whatever this is." He stopped an arm's length from her, not closer, not threatening, but close enough that she saw the rain gathering on the brim of his coat's collar. His hair was dark, peppered with silver, neatly trimmed, a professional, but not the kind she was used to from Evan's world. No slick smile, no hungry ambition, just a man on a mission. "Someone has been trying to reach you for months," he said again, quieter this time, as if the words might land better when softened. She blinked at him, confused and suddenly irritated. "If this is from Evan," she said, "you can tell him he's had all the access to me he wants." "We're done." "Your ex-husband?" the man asked, lifting a brow. "No, he has nothing to do with this." The rain thinned to a mist, drifting around them like breath in cold air. Mara looked at the sedan parked behind him. Its windows were tinted, its headlights dimmed but still cutting through the haze with a dull glow. This wasn't a rideshare. This wasn't a lawyer's car. And it definitely wasn't one of Evan's impulsive attempts at control. She crossed her arms. "Then who sent you?" The man's expression didn't change, but something in his posture softened, as if he understood what it meant for her to ask the question that way. "Caleb Rourke." The name hit her with the force of a door slamming somewhere deep inside her chest. The coldness she'd been feeling outside suddenly felt internal, sharp, startling. She hadn't heard that name spoken aloud in 12 years. She hadn't expected to hear it ever again. Her lips parted, but no sound formed. For a moment, the rain, the street, the shelter, all of it blurred as a memory rose. A narrow office in Chicago, a whiteboard covered with supply chain diagrams, a gentle voice saying, "Mara, you see angles most people can't even imagine." She swallowed hard. That's not possible. He wouldn't. Why now?" "That's what he'd like to explain," the man replied. She stepped back, the shelter's metal frame pressing into her shoulder blades. "No, I don't do that work anymore. I walked away. I made that clear." "Yes," the man said. "I think that's exactly why he wants to speak with you." Her pulse thudded in her ears. Curiosity stirred alive and unwelcome. It had been years since she'd let her mind drift anywhere near the world she left behind. She'd buried it under marriage, under routines, under the quiet belief that she wasn't meant for anything more complicated than being somebody's steady, forgettable wife. And yet, Caleb Rourke was not a man who resurfaced without reason. 12 years ago, he'd been rising fast, a strategist who understood freight, ports, and global movement like a chessboard. Now, if headlines were to be believed, he shaped markets from the shadows. A man like that didn't send strangers to bus shelters. "What does he want?" she asked, trying to control the tremor in her voice. "That," the man said, "is for him to tell you." She gave a humorless laugh. "You think I'm going to get into a strange car with a stranger because you dropped a name from my past?" "No," he said, "I think you won't. Which is why I brought proof." He reached into his coat slowly, deliberately, and pulled out a small waterproof pouch. Inside was a folded slip of paper. Paper, not a phone, not an email, a note. He offered it to her with both hands, like someone presenting something fragile. Mara hesitated, then took it. The pouch was cold, the zipper stiff from the damp air. She opened it and unfolded the slip inside. Her breath caught. The message wasn't long. It didn't need to be. Her name, Mara, written in a handwriting she had seen 1,000 times on old project notes, on margin scribbles beside equations, on the sticky notes he'd leave on her desk during those years when she still believed in her own talent. Below it, a line of encrypted phrasing, compact, precise, a signature of the world she had abandoned. Her fingers tightened around the paper. The man's voice lowered. "I was instructed to give you that only if you refuse to come with me." Her throat worked, trying to form a question. None came. Caleb Rourke. After 12 years of silence, after she had buried every part of her old self. Why now? Why today? Why her? She folded the note slowly, hands trembling in a way she hoped he didn't notice. The sedan waited behind him, engine barely audible, like a heartbeat steady and patient. She felt the damp air cling to her skin, the distant bus engine still nowhere in sight, the text from Emily still unread on her screen. Something was shifting beneath her feet, subtle but undeniable. She looked at the man again, and for the first time, she wondered whether disappearing had ever been a choice at all. Mara hadn't been in a car this new in years. It smelled like leather and secrets, the kind of scent that never appeared in the SUVs Evan used to lease for status. The door shut with a soft click, an expensive sound, and suddenly the rain and the cold and the shelter faded behind tinted glass. The quiet inside was unsettling. She sat with her hands carefully folded on her lap, unsure where to rest her gaze, unsure whether she was making the biggest mistake of her life or the first decision that actually belonged to her. The man in the gray coat took the front passenger seat. He didn't look back at her. The driver, a broad-shouldered man in a dark suit, simply pulled the car into traffic as if he'd been waiting for this moment all afternoon. Seattle drifted past the windows, neon signs blurred by rain, the faint outlines of cranes in the distance, coffee shops she hadn't stepped into in years. The city felt familiar and foreign, like a childhood home visited long after the furniture had changed. She brushed a drop of water from her cheek. Her tote lay beside her, a flimsy contrast to the polished leather around her. She kept one finger on its strap, grounding herself. For a long stretch, no one spoke. The silence pressed against her ribs. "Finally," she whispered. "How did he find me?" The man answered without turning. "Caleb has resources, but he didn't want to intrude until he had to." She let out a quiet, humorless breath. "This feels like intrusion." "Yes," the man said gently, "but necessary." She wasn't sure whether the shiver that moved through her was fear or recognition. Outside the window, the skyline shifted. They were passing through parts of the city she once knew, districts she'd crossed daily when she still wore blazers and carried 2 phones and believed she was built for pressure. Her gaze caught on a familiar warehouse with peeling blue paint, still standing after all these years. She remembered walking there with Caleb and their team, mapping out a crisis simulation on the floor with chalk because there had been no time to set up digital displays. She had loved that work, loved the urgency, loved the feeling that she could see patterns others missed. She had been good, frighteningly good. She clenched her hands together now, knuckles whitening. When Evan first said he couldn't handle her stress-level career, she had felt guilty. He worked long hours, too. He wanted stability. He said he wanted a partner who was home, not someone always on call with port authorities at midnight. She'd told herself letting go of that world was choosing family. But as the car glided past another old landmark, a building where she once solved a crisis with 40 minutes to spare something inside, her twisted, had she quit? Or had she shrunk? The thought sat heavy in her chest. For years, she'd brushed it aside, repeating that families required sacrifice. She never questioned why hers required only her sacrifices. Her throat tightened. She stared at the blurred reflections on the window, wondering what version of herself lived behind the glass and what version she had become outside of it. "Where are we going?" she asked quietly. The man in front finally turned, his gaze calm. "To meet Mr. Rourke." Her fingers twitched. He should have called or emailed. He tried. The man said, "Your ex-husband intercepted several messages." Mara's breath stilled. "Intercepted," she whispered. He believed those contacts were disruptive. Her stomach dropped, a slow, sinking motion like the ground shifting under her. Had Evan truly done that? Had he kept her from hearing from Caleb? From understanding why someone from her old life needed her? Heat pricked behind her eyes. Anger mixing with something far older, hurt she had never allowed herself to name. The car curved onto a wider street, buildings thinned. The rain began to lighten, leaving streaks of gray sky visible between drifting clouds. And then she saw it, the harbor. Tall cranes stood like skeletal giants in the distance, their silhouettes familiar even from far away. Cargo ships dotted the water, stacked containers rising like uneven columns against the fog. The smell of salt and diesel seeped through the air vents, faint but unmistakable. Her heart stumbled. "No," she murmured. "Why there?" The car slowed at a light, giving her a clearer view. The dock stretched outward, busy and restless even in the rain. Forklifts moved in steady patterns. Workers in neon vests shouted instructions over engines. A container swung slowly from a crane hook, suspended like a question waiting to drop. Caleb's territory. The world she had once belonged to. The world she had abandoned. A sudden ache rose in her chest, fear wrapped around familiarity. Old instincts flickering awake, though she tried to smother them. She could almost feel the old pulse of adrenaline she'd lived on, the sharp awareness she used to carry like a second spine. No, she couldn't go back. But the car was already turning toward the waterfront road. Why the harbor, she asked, her voice thinner than she wanted. The man didn't answer immediately, as if choosing his words with surgical care. "Because," he said at last, "that's where the problem is. What problem? One that requires someone with your mind." The words landed inside her like a tremor, small, but undeniable. Her pulse quickened. She pressed her hand to her tote again, needing the contact. The car turned down a private access road, the kind she hadn't seen in years. Security gates loomed ahead. The sedan approached with quiet authority, and the guard waved them through without even asking for identification. Mara's breath caught. This wasn't a casual invitation. This was something bigger, something wrong. As they rolled deeper along the harbor, she felt a cold awareness slide over her skin, as if the air itself knew something she didn't. She looked toward the man in the front seat. His expression didn't change, but the way he held himself told her one thing with perfect clarity. Whatever crisis was unfolding out there, whatever had made Caleb reach into the broken pieces of her life, it wasn't small. And as the car moved toward the shadowed expanse of cranes and containers, Mara felt something shift inside her, a quiet voice she thought she had buried, whispering, "Why now? Why you?" But beneath that, deeper, more dangerous, another question stirred. What if this was the part of you that was never meant to stay buried at all? The last time she stood in this building, she still believed she mattered. The thought struck her before she even stepped through the glass doors, settling over her like a chill pulled from the harbor wind. The lobby hadn't changed. Same slate floors, same industrial lights humming above, same faint scent of salt and paper. It was as if the years had folded in on themselves, leaving her stranded between who she once was and who she feared she'd become. The man in the gray coat led her down a quiet hallway. She tried to match his pace, but her chest tightened with every step. When he stopped at a door marked Operation Suite 3, he knocked once and pushed it open. Caleb stood inside. She froze. He hadn't changed in ways she expected. His hair was grayer, yes, and the lines around his eyes were deeper, but his presence, calm and steady, filled the room in the same reassuring way she remembered. He wore a charcoal sweater and dark slacks, simple clothes that made him appear more like a thoughtful professor than the strategist whose decisions influenced entire coastlines. "Mara," he said, his voice warm, surprised, relieved all at once. "You came." She didn't trust herself to speak. She managed a small nod. He walked toward her with an ease that made their long silence feel shorter than it was. When he reached her, he didn't reach for her hands or hug her. He simply stopped close enough that she felt seen. "It's good to have you here," he said quietly. Her breath caught. No one had said words like that to her in a very long time. He motioned toward a long table covered with screens, maps, and lines of code. The room buzzed with muted activity. Two analysts worked at their stations farther down, headphones on, unaware of the reunion. Caleb guided her to a large monitor. "Do you recognize it?" She did, even after 12 years. The forecasting interface looked familiar. She had spent years building its foundation, predictive routing, risk simulations, failure contingencies. It was once her proudest work. Yes, she whispered. Caleb tapped a series of keys. A web of global shipping routes appeared across the screen, glowing faintly in shades of blue and red. Red meant lag. Red meant trouble. Half the map was red. Her pulse quickened. What happened? That's what we're trying to figure out. His tone stayed steady, but she felt the gravity beneath it. The model is glitching in ways we've never seen. Delays in places that shouldn't have delays. Cargo diverted for no traceable reason. Early shortages across multiple states. She leaned in, scanning the data. Something felt wrong, but not random. A pattern existed. She could sense it like a faint heartbeat beneath noise. When did it start, she asked. 3 months ago? Slow at first, like the system was trying to warn us. And now, he hesitated. Now, it's accelerating. Her hands tightened on the table's edge. Numbers flickered, recalibrated, and flickered again. She used to understand this interface better than her own reflection. But now, her mind stumbled, rusty gears grinding from disuse. I'm not sure she began. Mara, he said gently. She looked up. He held her gaze with the same grounded steadiness he'd had back when she was 26 and full of fire. Back when he'd tell her she had an intuition for crisis patterns that couldn't be taught. You once told me this model needed a human mind to listen to it, Caleb said. Not just eyes. That was a long time ago. He shook his head. Not to the system, not to me. Her throat tightened. She turned back to the screen, trying to ignore the trembling in her fingers. The map shifted again more red, creeping outward like a slow infection. She swallowed. Why me? Caleb. There are hundreds of analysts out there now. Thousands. True, he said, but only one who understands the architecture the way you do. She felt heat rise in her chest, fear, disbelief, and something else she couldn't name. I'm not that person anymore. You're still her. His voice was low, not pushing, just certain. You've just been living in a place that didn't have room for her. Her breath caught, sharp. Evan's voice echoed in her memory. I can't handle your stress-level job. You're overreacting. Why can't you just be content? She blinked those words away. Caleb didn't look away from her. I didn't call you back because of your past, he said. I called you because no one else understands the system the way you do. The room seemed to still around her, the hum of screens fading. For years, she had carried the quiet suspicion that she had lost her edge, lost her worth, lost herself. Hearing the opposite from the only person who had ever truly seen her felt like a door opening, one she wasn't sure she was ready to step through. She stared at the monitor as the red patterns pulsed again. Caleb, she whispered, what if I fail? He turned slightly, not touching her, but close enough that she felt steadier. What if you don't? He asked softly. A tremor moved through her. She looked again at the screen, at the world tipping toward a crisis she didn't yet understand. Why him? Why now? Why her? But beneath the questions, something stirred, a flicker she hadn't felt in years. Possibility. She swallowed hard, unable to speak, and behind her reflection in the glass, the red routes kept pulsing, waiting for the one person who once knew how to listen. Caleb hesitated before saying it, which told her everything. He'd been steady until now, composed in the way only a man used to crisis could be. But the pause, that single careful breath he drew, felt like the moment just before a storm shifts direction. Mara, he began, his voice low, we found something in the system's logs. Something we can't explain. She watched the pulse of red across the map, the world flickering with trouble. What kind of something? He touched a key, pulling up a new screen, timestamps, access trails, authentication notes, digital fingerprints she hadn't seen in over a decade. He pointed to one line. This override happened 8 years ago. A patch slipped into the routing logic. It didn't break the system at the time, but it created a weakness that's exploding now. She leaned in, brow furrowing. Whose signature is that? He didn't answer. He just met her eyes. That hesitation again. Her pulse stuttered. Caleb. Whose he exhaled slowly. Evan Ellison. Her fingers went numb. For a moment she thought she heard him wrong, that her mind had twisted the name to fit the fear building inside her. But the letters on the screen didn't blink. They didn't soften. Her husband, her ex-husband, the man who told her he didn't understand her stress-level job, the man who complained she overthought everything, the man who said her work life was behind her, that she should focus on the present. Her voice was barely audible. Evan doesn't know anything about this system. No, Caleb said. He doesn't. The room tilted slightly. She gripped the table to steady herself. Then how did his credentials get in there? Caleb pulled up a second log IP addresses, origins of the unauthorized patch. He enlarged a line near the bottom. Her breath froze. That's... She blinked hard. That's our old address. He nodded. And that's my clearance terminal. Her mouth went dry, but I stopped using it years before that date. Another pause, another careful breath. The logs show the submission came from your home computer, he said, not your work laptop. The device ID is a match. She felt the floor thin beneath her, like standing on ice that had been cracking for years without her knowing. My home computer, she repeated, the words scraping out of her. Long after I left, Caleb didn't touch her, but he moved a fraction closer, enough that she felt anchored. We think someone accessed your old notes, someone who didn't understand them well enough to realize they'd destabilize the architecture. Notes, her notes, old drafts, unfinished models, the kind she used to scribble late at night after working hours, after dinner, after Evan fell asleep in front of the TV, ideas she wasn't allowed to pursue anymore because that part of life is over. Mara. Caleb clicked again. A screen of code appeared, her handwriting in the digital form. Shorthand only she ever used. Her ideas, her patterns, her private work, but broken, misplaced, misinterpreted, and altered by a hand that had no right to touch it. She swallowed hard. Someone must have copied my files. He didn't answer. She turned to him fully now, panic and disbelief warring in her voice. Caleb, Evan would never. He's not. But even as she said it, the truth threaded itself together like a chain pulling tight. Evan was capable of borrowing things that didn't belong to him if he convinced himself they somehow should. He'd taken credit for her emotional labor for years. Her scheduling, her thinking ahead, her worries he called overreactions until they saved them from mistakes. Her instincts he pretended were luck. He had taken from her mind long before he ever took from her computer. But why, she whispered? Caleb's expression softened. Maybe he thought it would help his consulting job. Maybe he wanted to impress a superior. Maybe he had no idea what he was touching. She pressed a hand to her temple. The room felt too warm. He never asked, she murmured. Not once. He never even asked what I was still working on. He didn't want to know. The most painful part wasn't that Evan had taken her work. It was that he'd never believed it mattered. She stared at the lines of corrupted code, the pieces of herself cut apart and repurposed by someone who didn't even value the source. He didn't just stop loving me, she whispered, the words trembling. He used me. He used my mind without ever valuing it. Caleb didn't interrupt. He didn't try to soften the truth. He simply let her reach it. Her eyes burned, but no tears came. It wasn't the kind of pain that cried. It was a hollowing, a realization so deep it pulled heat from her bones. Then, quietly, as if she were afraid of hearing it spoken aloud, she said, "He stole my work." The words settled between them, heavy and undeniable. She stepped back from the monitor, breath unsteady, the air suddenly too thin. Her marriage had ended officially that morning, but in this room, another ending unfolded, one she hadn't known she needed clarity about, one she wished she could unlearn. What if it hadn't been a marriage at all? What if it had been something else, something built on what she could provide rather than who she was? She felt the question form, sharp and unbearable. Could her entire life with Evan have been shaped by this? Not love, but use. The thought pressed against her ribs, tightening until she could barely inhale. And as she stared at the screen, at the proof glowing in cold blue letters, she realized she wasn't ready for the answer. Caleb led her down a narrow hallway toward a room she didn't remember. The corridor smelled faintly of old lumber and sea air, the scent the building had always carried. But tonight it felt heavier, like walking into a memory that had been waiting for her return. He stopped at a metal door, rested his hand briefly on the frame, and pushed it open. Lights flickered on overhead. Mara froze. Boxes lined the walls from floor to ceiling, stacked neatly, labeled in familiar slanted handwriting she hadn't used in years. Notebooks, folders, sketch pads, rough draft binders she always meant to organize someday. She stepped inside as if entering a chapel. The last time she stood in this building, she still believed she mattered. The thought came like a whisper she couldn't hold back. Her fingers brushed the edge of a worn cardboard lid. How did these get here? Caleb stood behind her, hands in his coat pockets. You left them when you resigned? The admin was going to toss everything. I thought, you might want them someday. She swallowed, throat tight. Someday turned into 12 years. I know, he said gently. She lifted the lid from the nearest box. Inside, notebooks were stacked like bricks color-coded, dates on the spine. She pulled one out, then another. Her name was written inside each cover, sometimes in black pen, sometimes blue, sometimes the thick marker she used after too much coffee and too little sleep. A strange ache rose in her chest. It wasn't nostalgia, it was something lonelier. These are mine, she whispered. All of them. Every one, Caleb said. I kept them in case you came back. Her breath caught. No one had kept anything for her in a very long time. She opened the first notebook. Inside, her handwriting sprawled across the page equations running up the margins, arrows, diagrams of shipping lanes, notes about labor strikes in places she'd never traveled but understood better than people thought she should. Mara felt her pulse stutter. This was the woman she used to be, the woman she'd poured into work until life demanded she shrink. She hadn't looked at these pages since the year Evan asked her to scale back. Not directly, not in these colors. She had forgotten the way her own mind once moved wide, fast, curious, brave. Caleb, she said softly, I don't remember any of this. He gave a quiet nod. You were brilliant. You still are. The room felt warmer suddenly, too warm. She set the notebook down before her hands shook. I thought I left everything behind. I thought that was what a good wife did. Caleb's expression shifted sad. Knowing you could have kept both, Mara, work and home. You just didn't have a partner who believed that. The truth landed hard. She ran a hand along a stack of folders, her fingertips grazing dust she didn't remember letting settle. Why didn't you reach out? She asked. I did. He hesitated, and something weary moved across his face. Many times. She turned to him. He continued, voice low, careful. I called, I emailed. I even stopped by your house once, maybe 2 years after you left. Evan always said you were busy, or resting, or not taking calls. He said you were happier out of the field. Her breath went shallow. He said that he insisted you didn't want contact, and I didn't want to disrupt your personal life, if that was true. He paused, but it never felt true. The grief cracked then, not loud, not visible to the eye, but inside something split cleanly, like a seam that had been holding too much weight for too long. She sank onto a small wooden stool near the wall. Dust lifted around her like tired confetti. I thought no one remembered me. I thought I stopped mattering. Caleb didn't answer right away. He walked to another stack, pulled down a binder, and set it gently beside her. You mattered, he said, enough for me to save every page. She opened the binder, more diagrams, more patterns, more proof of a life she'd buried beneath laundry cycles and careful dinners she cooked to make Evan less irritable. Beneath the weight of being easy, pleasant, supportive, she had disappeared inside her own life, one compromise at a time, until the woman who wrote these pages existed only in dust and cardboard. She flipped to a half-torn sheet with a sketched model, a rough, early draft of a system meant to predict cascade failures in port rotations. Her eyes narrowed. She recognized it, not because she remembered writing it, but because it was almost identical to the section Caleb had shown earlier, the failing part of the national forecasting model. Her handwriting, her design, Her work. She lifted the page with trembling fingertips. Caleb. This is the same segment. The one crashing. He nodded once. Yes. So? The weak point. Her voice thinned. It came from me. From work you never finished, Caleb corrected quietly. Work someone stole years ago. Twisted. Misapplied. You didn't break the system. Mara. Someone else did, by pretending your half-formed idea was ready to deploy. Her throat burned. The grief was no longer quiet. It was an old wound reopening under bright light. She closed the binder gently, as if the paper inside were fragile. Maybe she was the fragile one. Maybe she always had been. And she'd mistaken fragility for humility. I don't know if I can do this again, she said. I don't know if I'm enough. Caleb leaned against the wall, arms folded. You know the system better than anyone. Better than I do. Better than the teams running it now. He waited a beat. You came back for a reason. She shook her head. I came back because someone sent a car. No, he said, voice soft. You came back because a part of you still remembers who you were. Her chest tightened. She looked around the room at the shelves, the boxes, the pages carrying the imprint of her younger mind, a past self staring up at her, asking who she had become. The question she didn't want to face crept in. Unwelcome and unavoidable, was she ready to help fix the system, knowing that doing so might reveal what Evan had done? Expose him, expose their marriage for what it really was. The thought lodged itself in her ribs, sharp as a splinter. She closed the notebook slowly, her hand lingering on the cover. She wasn't ready to answer. Not yet. Her daughter's voice was the one sound she wasn't ready for. Mara had just stepped outside the storage room when her phone vibrated. The hallway was dim, lit only by a single overhead bulb humming like a tired insect. She glanced at the screen. Emily, her heart climbed into her throat. She answered before she had time to think. Mom Emily's voice came thin through the line, blurred by the cold air between Seattle and her college town several states away. Are you okay? Dad said you were dramatic today. Mara closed her eyes. The word pressed against her like an old bruise. I'm all right, she said softly. The rain had picked up outside. She could hear it tapping against the window at the end of the hall, soft, persistent, the way drizzle always sounded in this city. It filled the silence when she didn't know what else to say. Emily continued, her words stumbling over frustration. Dad told me you got emotional in the office, that you made everything harder than it needed to be. He said you've been doing that for years. Mara leaned her shoulder against the wall, steadying herself. Out in the harbor, fog was rolling in, softening the outlines of cranes and dock lights. The world looked blurred, as if it, too, was caught between past and present. Is that what he said? She murmured. I don't know what to think, Emily admitted. I've never seen you like this. You always try to keep things calm. And now you're leaving, and everything feels like it's falling apart. A part of Mara wanted to apologize, to say she was sorry for the mess, for the discomfort, for being the one who couldn't hold the marriage together. That instinct ran deep, like muscle memory. But another part of her, the quieter and newly awakening part, resisted. She said, it's all right to feel confused. Emily exhaled shakily. Dad says you overthink everything, that you always ruin good moments by worrying too much. He says he tried to make things work, but you made it harder. Mara let the words sink in, their edges sharp, familiar. She had heard versions of them whispered at dinner tables, tossed casually during arguments, delivered as gentle advice that somehow always left her smaller. But hearing them through her daughter's voice felt different. It was like listening to her own history being read back to her, rewritten, rearranged, stripped of the truth she had lived. She walked slowly toward the window, the floorboards creaking beneath her feet. Outside, the harbor lights flickered across the water, golden and unsteady, like lanterns searching for something lost. Emily, she said quietly, do you really believe I ruin good moments? A long silence followed. I don't know, Emily whispered. Dad just He always made it sound like he was fixing things, that you were the one causing tension. Mara pressed her palm to the cold window pane, grounding herself in its chill. She felt her pulse flutter in her wrist, a soft, unsettled beat. "I see," she said. Emily's breath wavered. "Mom, I just want to understand. I want that too." Mara swallowed, her throat tight. But understanding takes time, and honesty. Another pause, longer, more fragile. Emily spoke again, softer. "Are you mad at me for asking?" "No," Mara said. "Never." She meant it. Love didn't disappear just because truth was hard. A muffled sound came over the line. Maybe Emily wiping her nose. Maybe shifting in a small dorm room. Mara suddenly realized she'd never visited as often as she'd meant to. "I don't know whose fault anything is," Emily said. I want us to be okay." Mara breathed in deeply. The scent of sea air drifted in through a draft in the wall, carrying salt and something metallic. It reminded her of all the nights she'd worked late in this building, while Evan complained at home, waiting with resentment instead of support. She couldn't erase the past, but she could stop pretending. "Emily," she said gently, "can I ask you something?" "Yeah." Her hand trembled slightly as she kept it on the window, steadying herself. "When you say I overthink things, that I ruin good moments." Her voice was soft, steady, but inside she felt a tight ache uncoiling. "Where did you hear that? From me? Or from your father?" The question settled between them like a stone dropped into deep water. Emily didn't answer right away. Her silence wasn't angry or distant. It was thinking silence, something rare in their conversations. Mara could almost hear the wheels turning, the memories shifting in new light. "Mom," Emily said at last, voice suddenly small. "I'm not sure anymore." The words trembled with uncertainty, with the beginning of a crack forming in a story she'd grown up believing. Mara's breath shook. She hadn't expected an answer, not this one. Not so soon. She leaned more heavily against the window, the cold cutting through her coat, grounding her. "Take your time," Mara said quietly. "You don't have to know right now." "But I want to," Emily whispered. "I want to understand what really happened." Mara closed her eyes, letting the rain's rhythm fill the space between them. "I'm here," she said. "Whenever you're ready." There was another pause, soft, searching, uncertain. "Mom?" Emily asked. "Yes. Did you ever feel unheard?" The question struck like a tender blow, unexpected and aching. Mara opened her eyes slowly, watching the blurred harbor lights dance on the dark water. She didn't answer. Not yet. At 11:47 p.m., Mara placed her hands on a keyboard she had avoided for 12 years. The small operations room was nearly silent, except for the hum of servers along the wall. A thin blue glow washed over her skin as the screen woke under her touch. Outside, the harbor was a dark shape pressed against the windows, the cranes like quiet guardians watching over the night shift. Everything felt suspended, as if the world were holding its breath with her. She flexed her fingers, feeling the stiff ache at each joint. She wasn't 30 anymore. She wasn't the young analyst who used to fly through forecasts with coffee-fueled confidence and restless energy. Tonight, she felt older, tired, uncertain, but present in a way she hadn't been in years. The cursor blinked, patient, waiting. She inhaled once, slow and shaky, then began typing a command she once knew by heart. The letters came hesitantly at first, then faster, muscle memory stitching itself back together like an old song she thought she'd forgotten. Lines of data streamed across the screen. Her pulse lifted excitement, dread, an old familiar electricity. She leaned closer, brushing a strand of hair behind her ear. The system she helped design still recognized her logic style. It was like opening a diary written in numbers and flows, something intimate and deeply personal. She ran the first simulation. The screen flickered, paused, and resolved into a map of domestic shipping routes. Red dots pulsed on 3 major ports. Yellow lines flickered. A cascading delay pattern was forming, subtle, but unmistakable. Her throat tightened. She zoomed into the west branch of the model. There, buried in a loop of predictive code, sat the flaw Evan had introduced years ago. A shortcut disguised as an efficiency upgrade. It misread weather data and suppressed early warnings instead of amplifying them. Her breath trembled. "You didn't even understand what you took," she whispered. She remembered the night he'd insisted she hand over her old notebooks. He said he needed them to help with a client. She thought he wanted to understand her world better. She thought that meant love, but he'd only taken what he could use. She closed her eyes for a moment, steadying herself against a wave of anger and grief. Those feelings wanted space, wanted to spill out, but she didn't have the luxury to sit with them. Not tonight. Not with the model blinking warnings like distant thunder. She corrected Evan's patch and reran the code. This time, some of the red dots dimmed. The West Coast failures slowed. A small victory too small to breathe easier, but real. Then the next layer emerged. Delays shifted to the South Corridor, linking inland hubs. The pattern grew sharper, more aggressive, like watching cracks spread through glass. She leaned forward, scrolling through thousands of data entries, the motions familiar but heavier. 12 years away had taken something from her speed, maybe, or stamina, but not her instinct. And her instinct said the system was in more trouble than anyone had admitted. At 12:31 a.m., she triggered a full network diagnostic, something she used to reserve only for potential national disruptions. The process lagged, the servers whirred louder. For a moment, she thought the whole system might stall. Then a grid of the continental U.S. appeared. Nearly a third of the major transport nodes flashed orange. 4 flashed red. Her breath hitched. She clicked deeper. The red nodes were interdependent. If one failed, the others would spiral. And if those spiraled, the entire network ports, rail shipments, essential supply chains would slip out of sync within days. The room felt colder. She typed quickly, cross-checking the oldest logs with recent activity. Her hands shook once, but she forced them steady. She worked through algorithm branches she'd written in her 20s, marveling at how young she'd once been, how bold. She followed disruptions through code like tracking a storm across the ocean, finding the point where everything began to tilt. One part of her mind whispered she was too late, that someone else should be doing this, that the woman who once owned these numbers was gone, replaced by someone smaller, someone scared, someone still reeling from a marriage that left her invisible. But another part, quiet, newly awake, told her to keep going. She fixed another sequence, crossed out outdated logic, restored a buffer she'd recommended years ago, but Evan had removed in his patch. The system's pulse steadied in places, but faltered in others. "You can do this," she murmured, though she didn't know if she believed herself or simply needed to hear the words spoken aloud. Minutes stretched into an hour, maybe more. Time blurred into the rhythm of clicking keys and flashing data. She felt sweat bead at her temple even though the room stayed cold. Her back ached, her eyes burned. Then, without warning, the screen dimmed. "Come on," she whispered, tapping the keys. A flashing banner slid across the top. "Critical alert. Cascade risk imminent." Her heart slammed into her ribs. An internal error message took over the whole display, glowing a harsh red. The ports that had dimmed earlier reactivated. The clusters widened. The entire grid pulsed like a heartbeat, faltering. No, no, no. She breathed. She tried to override it, but the system resisted. Someone had locked certain commands behind credentials she no longer had. Someone had added new layers she didn't recognize. She felt her pulse hammering in her ears. The alert blinked again. Brighter. "Critical alert, national logistics failure possible within 72 hours. Her hands froze on the keyboard. For a moment, she didn't think about Evan or the divorce or even her years away. She thought about what this meant for the people whose lives depended on these routes, for the nation that trusted this system, for the team that didn't understand the storm already forming beneath their feet. Her chair creaked as she leaned back, breath shallow, eyes locked on the relentless red glow. Was it still solvable, or had the crisis already slipped past the point where she, one woman working in the middle of the night, could pull it back, The question hung in the cold air, heavy and unforgiving. She didn't have an answer. Not yet. She had faced storms at sea before, but never a room full of people waiting for her to save them. Mara stood at the far end of the long conference table, the city lights of the harbor glowing behind her like a restless constellation. The room buzzed with low conversation as officials filed in, port directors, regional logistics officers, 2 aides from the state's emergency operations division. Their jackets dripped with the midnight rain, and their expressions showed the quiet panic of people who sensed a storm they couldn't yet name. She folded her hands in front of her to keep them steady. She had not stood at the head of a table in more than a decade. Then Evan walked in. He stopped mid-step when he saw her. For a heartbeat. His face didn't move like someone had frozen his expression before surprise could settle. He wore one of the tailored gray suits she used to pick out for him, back when she still believed she was helping him step into a future they shared. Now the suit looked too sharp, too polished for the trembling situation he was walking into. "Mara," he said, disbelief edging his voice. She kept her chin level. "Good evening, Evan." His eyes flicked to her worn sweater, her hair pulled back too quickly, the dark circles under her eyes from hours at the desk. She could almost feel him assessing her, measuring her, cataloging imperfections he could use. He recovered with a small, practiced smile. "I didn't realize you were involved." "She is," Caleb said from the doorway. His voice carried the kind of authority Evan never could imitate. "She's leading the analysis tonight." Evan blinked, then laughed softly, too softly. Leading, he said it the way people say impossible. A few officials turned their heads. Mara felt the heat of attention gathering like a spotlight. She breathed in slowly. Her chest tightened, but she didn't let the breath falter. Caleb took a seat at the side, arms calm on the table. "Let's begin," he said. When everyone settled, Mara stepped forward. Her reflection glimmered faintly in the glass behind her small but upright. She kept her gaze on the faces in front of her, not on her reflection. "The forecasting system is failing," she began. Her voice surprised her, clear, steady, not quite loud but firm enough to carry. One of the port directors leaned forward. "How soon?" "Within 72 hours, she said. "Multiple corridors will be compromised." A murmur rippled around the table. Evan rested his elbows casually, trying to look unfazed. "Are we sure this isn't an overreaction?" he asked lightly. Sometimes models flag anomalies that settle on their own. Something inside her wavered, an old instinct urging her to shrink, to smooth the moment, to let him steer the room. But she stayed still. "The anomalies have escalated," she said. "They correlate with an unauthorized patch submitted years ago. That patch altered predictive flow, suppressed early warnings." And Evan cut in, "Well, patches happen all the time. Sweetheart." I'm sure Caleb's head snapped toward him. "Don't call her that." The room went silent. Evan blinked as if the word had slipped out unintentionally. Mara felt the echo of it, "sweetheart," the same condescending softness he used whenever he wanted to diminish her without appearing cruel. She kept her tone even. "The patch," she continued, "was submitted under your consulting credentials." Evan stiffened, the smallest movement, shoulders tensing, jaw locking, barely perceptible to anyone who didn't know him. She had spent half her life reading those tiny shifts. He leaned back, forcing a smile. "That's impossible. I've never worked on that system. Mara, maybe you're misreading the logs. They're extremely technical." A subtle sting bloomed behind her ribs. Technical? As if she hadn't built half the architecture from scratch. She pulled up the file on the screen behind her. "These are the credentials used." A pause. "And this is the device ID." The ID flashed a string she recognized instantly. Their old home computer. The one Evan had insisted she throw away after an upgrade. The one she thought was gone. The officials turned toward Evan. He cleared his throat. "We shared that computer. Anyone could—" "No," Mara said quietly. "I stopped working before that date." Her hands trembled once as she gripped the edge of the table. She tightened her hold until they steadied. A logistics officer adjusted his glasses. "Mr. Ellison." Are you suggesting your credentials were used without your knowledge? I'm suggesting my ex-wife may be confused, Evan replied smoothly. The divorce has been stressful. I'm sure she's doing her best. But Mara's stomach twisted, the old familiar humiliation curling at its edges, the way he could weaponize gentleness, the way he made her sound fragile in rooms where she once held command. But Caleb spoke before she could. Enough, he said, voice like steel wrapped in velvet. She identified system failures none of us caught. She's the only reason this room knows what's coming. The tension broke like a snapped wire. Mara forced herself to breathe evenly. The officials turned back toward her. Their attention felt heavy, not skeptical, not yet convinced, but waiting. She swallowed the tightness in her throat. The unauthorized patch created a blind spot, she said. That blind spot is expanding. If we don't act now, the delays will cascade into every major corridor. Evan shifted, opening his mouth again, but she lifted a hand slightly. Not to silence him, she had no power for that, but to steady herself, to hold the space that belonged to her. Her next words came out quieter, but sharper. The system didn't fail on its own. She let the truth settle. Someone broke it. A long, weighted silence filled the room. Evan's face stayed controlled, but she saw the flicker, the smallest flinch in the corner of his eye, exposed only because she had spent years learning the language of his expressions. Officials exchanged looks, questions formed behind their eyes. Mara held her breath. Would they hear her? Would they see her? Or would the room turn again toward the man who'd always spoken louder? The uncertainty trembled like a thin wire inside her. She wasn't sure which way the moment would break. Sometimes the truth doesn't explode. Sometimes it sighed its way into the open. Mara sat alone in a narrow hallway outside the conference room, her back resting against a cold pillar, the warmth of her earlier resolve slowly draining out of her limbs. The building had quieted. The officials who once filled the space with clipped voices and restless movements were now behind closed doors with Evan, asking questions she could only imagine. Their muted voices filtered faintly through the walls, sharp at first, then dull, like waves hitting a breakwater until their force weakened. Mara kept her gaze on the floor, on the faint scuffs left by boots and rolling carts. Her hands lay folded in her lap, still trembling from the adrenaline of the meeting. She wasn't sure if the tremble came from speaking truth in front of a room full of people, or from the long, cold echo of Evan trying to shrink her one last time. She heard his voice rise once sharp, defensive, but it cracked midway, collapsing into something quieter. A second voice followed, firm and measured, then silence. Caleb emerged for a moment, walking past her with a clipboard. He paused long enough to hold her gaze, offering a small, grounding nod. Not a triumphal one, not a reassuring one, just a nod that said, "You made it here." Then he disappeared again. She waited, blinking against exhaustion. She watched lights from the harbor flicker through the glass door beside her. Cargo cranes loomed like quiet giants in the night. She remembered standing in this building when she was 26, fearless, certain she could predict storms before they formed. Now she wasn't sure if she was trying to outrun one or walk back into one. The conference room door clicked open at last. Evan stepped out. His face had lost its practiced composure. His eyes avoided hers completely. For a moment, he looked like a man trying to gather himself after being hit by something he didn't see coming. His shoulders slumped. The certainty he always carried had drained away, leaving him smaller somehow. He passed her without a word. She didn't move, didn't call after him, didn't feel vindicated. Just tired and ache running from her chest to her throat, the kind of ache that followed a truth buried too long. An official approached her next, his tone gentle. "We'll need you in the morning," he said. "Try to rest." "Ms. Ellison?" She nodded. Rest felt like a foreign concept. After the man walked away, her phone buzzed. The sound startled her enough that she fumbled with the device. She expected maybe a message from Caleb, or a system notification, or nothing at all, but it was Emily. Her thumb hovered before she answered. "Mom." Emily's voice came through in gasps, uneven, wet. the kind of crying someone tried to hold back but couldn't. "Mom, are you there?" Mara straightened, heart squeezing. "I'm here." There was a small, broken sound on the other end. Dad wasn't honest with me. The words landed like soft gravel across her chest, painful but not unexpected. Mara closed her eyes. The hallway felt colder. She imagined her daughter in some dim dorm room with string lights and textbooks scattered everywhere, shoulders hunched, the world tilting under her feet. "What happened?" she asked quietly. I asked him about what you said, about the things he told me over the years." Emily sniffed. "He got so defensive. He said you were confused, that you were stressed, that you were making things up. But then I pushed harder, and he got quiet. He wouldn't look at me." Mara let out a slow breath. She had lived that moment so many times, trying to talk, trying to ask, trying to understand, always met with defensiveness, always blamed for asking. And then Emily continued, voice breaking. "He said maybe he misremembered a few things. Just a few. But it felt like he was admitting more than that." Mara pressed her hand against her forehead. The truth wasn't satisfying. It didn't feel like justice. It felt like walking barefoot over ground littered with old glass pieces everywhere. None sharp enough to cut now, but all reminders of how the breaks first happened. "Mom," Emily whispered, "I'm so sorry. I didn't know. I should have." "No," Mara said softly. "No, sweetheart. You couldn't have known. But I believed him." Emily's voice cracked again. "I believed things about you that weren't fair. I repeated them. I thought you were just anxious, always worrying about nothing, always ruining things. I'm so sorry." Mara closed her eyes, swallowing the tightness rising in her throat. She wanted to comfort her daughter, to lift the weight she could hear pressing down on her. But another part of her, new and uncertain, wanted something different. Boundaries, truth spoken gently but clearly. "Emily," she said after a long breath, "we will talk." A beat of quiet, trembling. "But," she added, her voice low and steady, truthfully this time. Emily inhaled sharply on the other end, as if absorbing the shape of those words, as if hearing, maybe for the first time, that her mother wasn't stepping around difficult things anymore. "Mama," Emily whispered. Mara felt her own eyes sting. "It's all right," she murmured. "We'll find our way through this. Together." Emily exhaled shakily. "I want to understand everything. I really do." "And I'll tell you," Mara said. But when she ended the call and lowered the phone, she felt the question rise, not sharp, but deep. What did healing look like after years of silence? She didn't know. Not yet. The rental was small, but the window opened to the sea, and that was enough. Mara stood in the center of the living room, a single duffel bag at her feet, the quiet hum of the refrigerator echoing in the otherwise empty space. The afternoon light drifted through the large window, pale and silvery, catching dust motes that floated like tiny fragments of a new beginning. From where she stood, she could see the edge of the harbor, the cranes moving slowly as evening crept in. The water shimmered in long strokes of blue-gray, restless but steady. She exhaled. The room didn't feel like home yet, but it felt like a place where she could hear herself think. She walked to the window and pushed it open. A soft breeze rolled in, carrying the faint smell of salt and engine oil scents she hadn't realized she missed. Her old life had been filled with these smells once, before she traded them for scented candles and quiet dinners in a house where she was always careful not to be too much. Now, there was no one to be careful for. She set her bag down and began unpacking with slow, deliberate motions. Folded clothes, a toothbrush, a few essentials. She took out the notebook Caleb had given her, one of the old ones he had saved, and placed it gently on the narrow table by the window. It looked almost ceremonial, like returning something sacred to its rightful place. For a long moment, she simply stood there, watching the coastline shift with the lowering sun. The quiet didn't feel empty anymore. It felt like space. By the next morning, she had fallen into a routine, not a rigid one, but something soft, tentative. She walked to the harbor office with a cup of coffee warming her hands. She worked slowly at first, reviewing data, running small tests, consulting with Caleb's team as they navigated the system's fragile recovery. She didn't take the lead, not yet. She wasn't sure she wanted to, but she offered guidance, quiet and consistent, and the room listened to her with a respect she hadn't felt since she was much younger. One afternoon, as she adjusted a simulation model, Caleb stepped beside her. "You're settling in," he said gently. She nodded, trying to. He smiled, just a small lift at the corner of his mouth. "It suits you. Being back." Her eyes drifted toward the window, where a gull circled above the water, riding the draft with easy confidence. "I don't know if I'm back," she said. "Not the way I used to be." "Maybe not," Caleb replied. "But you're here. That's enough for now." When he walked away, she felt something shift lightly, cautiously, like a door gently unlatched but not yet pushed open. In the evenings, she took slow walks along the waterfront. Her steps were unhurried, her senses adjusting to a world that no longer required her to shrink. The sound of waves against the pier, the call of distant foghorns, the steady pulse of life at the harbor, all of it softened something inside her. Sometimes she saw couples walking hand in hand, sometimes families. She didn't envy them. She only observed, the way a person watches birds overhead, aware that life comes in many shapes, none needing to mirror her own. She was learning how to be alone without being lost. One night, as the sky deepened into a muted cobalt, her phone buzzed in her coat pocket. She hesitated before checking it, a familiar tightness returning to her chest. She had only just begun feeling steady. Messages, especially from family, had a way of tilting the ground under her feet. It was Emily. "Mom, can I come see you? I don't want to talk over the phone anymore." Mara stopped walking. The air felt sharper, colder. She read the message again, letting each word settle. Her first instinct was yes, immediate, hopeful. Her second instinct was fear. Fear that she would slip into old patterns. Fear that she would soften too quickly. Fear that her daughter would come seeking reassurance in the same ways that had once swallowed her whole. Fear and longing. She walked to the railing overlooking the water and rested her hands there. The metal felt cool against her palms. The harbor lights rippled across the surface like scattered stars. She breathed in deeply, steadying herself. She loved Emily. That had never changed. But love without boundaries had drained her for years. Now she needed something different, something healthier, something new. She typed 3 words, then deleted them. Typed again, deleted again. She closed her eyes, letting the breeze touch her face, letting it remind her that the world could be gentle even when she didn't know what came next. Finally, she wrote, "Come, but let's start new." Her thumb hovered, then pressed send. The message delivered instantly, leaving a quiet ache blooming in her chest, hope mixed with caution, tenderness tied to the faint tremor of uncertainty. She kept staring at the screen for several seconds, as if expecting another message right away. None came. She slipped the phone back into her coat. Something in her eased, just slightly. As she turned to walk toward her small rental, the night wrapped around her softly. The sound of the waves followed, steady and patient, like something that had been waiting for her to listen again. But a question lingered behind every step she took, gentle yet weighty. Could a mother and daughter rebuild what had been lost, or would the past tug at them harder than the hope of something new? Emily stood at the door, older somehow, holding a pie she didn't know her mother was allergic to. For a second, neither of them moved. The hallway light fell across Emily's face, softening the tension in her eyes, revealing the exhaustion she had tried to hide. Mara felt her breath catch not in hurt, but in an ache that had lived inside her too long. Her daughter looked like a child and a stranger all at once. "Hi, Mom," Emily whispered. Mara stepped aside gently, giving her space to enter. The smell of cinnamon drifted in with her, warm and familiar, but tinged with something bittersweet. Emily set the pie down on the kitchen counter, her hands trembling just enough for a mother to notice. The small rental suddenly felt smaller, filled with unspoken years. "You look good," Emily said, her voice thin, like she was afraid it might crack under too much weight. "So do you," Mara answered. She meant it. Emily looked stronger, yet frayed at the edges, the way young adults often are when they realize the world won't protect them from the truth. Silence followed, stretching slowly between them. Mara didn't rush to fill it. That was new. Old Mara might have scrambled to soothe, to reassure, to make everything gentle and easy. This Mara stood still and let the quiet breathe. Emily sat at the little table by the window, folding her hands in her lap. "Dad said you were doing all this to punish him." Her eyes flickered up. "But I don't think that's true anymore." Mara pulled out the chair across from her and sat, her movements careful, grounding. "No," she said softly. "I'm not doing anything to punish anyone. I'm just finding my way again." Emily swallowed, her shoulders lifting then falling like a slow tide. "I believed him," she whispered. "All those years. Every time he said you were overreacting. Every time he said you didn't understand things, I thought he was just being honest." A faint sting rose behind Mara's eyes, but she kept her face steady. Emily needed space to speak, not a mother unraveling in front of her. "I know," Mara said. "It's okay." "No," Emily answered quickly, a tear slipping before she could wipe it away. "It's not okay. I hurt you. I didn't even ask for your side. I just took what was easiest." Mara looked at her daughter, the girl she raised, the child she protected, the young woman she had watched drift away. All the things she could have said crowded her chest the nights she cried alone, the years she doubted her own mind, the way silence had become her only survival. But she chose mercy instead of recounting wounds. "You were a kid," Mara said quietly. "Kids believe the stories they're told, and I wasn't strong enough back then to tell mine." Emily's face crumpled. "I should have seen something. I should have—" "You couldn't have," Mara said gently, cutting through the guilt before it could sink deeper. "I hid too well, and I let your father speak for me. That wasn't your fault." Emily nodded, tears slipping freely now. She wiped them with the sleeve of her sweater, looking younger with each trembling breath. "I'm sorry," she said again, softer this time, the words not for apology but for recognition. Mara reached across the table, her hand stopping halfway, not from reluctance, but thoughtful intention. Old patterns could start with one impulsive gesture. Emily noticed the pause, her eyes widening with understanding. She bridged the last half-inch herself, placing her hand over her mother's, their fingers folded together, tentative but real. For a long moment they sat like that, neither speaking. The harbor wind brushed against the window, tapping lightly, as if reminding them both that even the quiet could be healing. "I didn't know about the system," Emily finally said. "About what Dad did. When I heard—" She shook her head. "It felt like losing him and finding you on the same day. And I didn't know which feeling to follow." Mara's voice dipped low, warm but steady. "You don't have to choose between us. You just have to choose what's true." Emily nodded again, slow and honest. "I want to know you, the real you, not the version Dad told." Mara felt her chest tighten not painfully, but in a way that reminded her she was alive. That connection could be something earned, not assumed. "I want that too," she said, "but I need us to do it differently this time." Emily looked up, nervous but hopeful. "Different how I can't disappear again," Mara said. "I can't bend myself small to keep peace. If we're rebuilding, you'll have to meet me as I am now, not how I was before." The words hung in the air, gentle but firm. Emily absorbed them with a seriousness that surprised Mara. "I see you now," Emily whispered. "I really do." Those 4 words, unexpected, delicate, and sharp with truth, landed between them like the softest kind of miracle. Mara closed her eyes briefly, letting the warmth of it settle, but beneath the warmth was something else, an echo of uncertainty. Seeing her was one thing, truly understanding her, and the life she might still reclaim, was another. When she opened her eyes again, Emily was watching her with a mixture of love and fear, as if afraid Mara might slip away before she finished healing. "What happens now?" Emily asked quietly. Mara didn't answer right away. She looked toward the open window, where the sea moved in slow, silver strokes. Beyond it lay a bigger life, one she once belonged to, one that scared her as much as it called to her. Would she step into it again, or would she stay here, in this small but safe space she carved out of the wreckage? Her breath trembled, not from fear, but from the weight of possibility. "I don't know yet," she murmured, and the question lingered between them, fragile and full of promise. Would Mara choose to rejoin a bigger life, or stay small and safe? The limo wasn't for glamour. It was for protection and for respect. Mara realized that the moment she saw it, waiting at the curb outside her small rental, its dark windows glowing faintly with the reflection of dawn. The early light painted the harbor in muted gold, water shifting like an old secret learning to speak again. She stood still for a breath, fingers wrapped around the sleeve of her coat, surprised at the steadiness inside her. The driver stepped out as soon as she approached. He greeted her by name, a quiet, "Good morning, Ms. Ellison." That held no assumption, no judgment, only recognition. She couldn't remember the last time someone said her name like that. Maybe never. She exhaled softly and climbed in. The interior felt nothing like the car she had ridden in the day her marriage ended. That ride had been filled with silence that pressed down on her, making her small. This one felt spacious, anchored, as if the world outside had expanded instead of closing in. As the door shut, she felt the hum of the engine beneath her seat, low and certain. The city slid by in streaks of pale orange, buildings waking slowly in the growing light. Her reflection in the window didn't look like the woman who once hid behind someone else's voice. She looked awake, not fully healed, not fully sure, but present in a way she hadn't been in years. She touched the glass lightly. "I'm not disappearing again," she whispered. The words surprised her with their steadiness. Years ago, she might have needed someone else to echo them back, to make them real. Today, the quiet inside the car was answer enough. Traffic slowed as they neared the waterfront. She could see the cranes at the docks, silhouettes rising against the sunrise. The harbor headquarters came into view, sharp lines, tall windows catching the early light. A place she once walked away from because she believed shrinking herself kept a family intact. A place she never imagined returning to under her own name. The car curved toward a restricted entrance, rolling past guards who checked the driver's ID before waving them through. Mara felt her pulse lift, not in fear this time, but in recognition. A part of her had always belonged to this world, problem-solving under pressure, seeing patterns others missed, holding steady when systems began to fray. She hadn't lost that. It had only been buried, still. Her breath hitched when she saw the small group waiting outside the entrance. Officials in dark coats, analysts with clipboards. Caleb among them, hands tucked in his pockets, gaze lifted toward the approaching car. For a moment, old habits tightened around her ribs, the urge to shrink, to apologize for taking up space. But then she felt the softness of the leather seat under her palms, the quiet hum of the engine offering a final moment to choose who she would be when the door opened. She straightened her shoulders. The limo slowed to a stop. Her reflection stared back at her in the tinted window. Framed by dawn, a woman stepping into a life she once designed but abandoned, not because she wasn't capable, but because she thought love required her to be small. The driver came around to her side and opened the door. Cool morning air brushed against her face, tinged with salt and diesel, and something like possibility. She stepped out, placing her feet firmly on the pavement. The officials straightened, some exchanging quick murmurs. Caleb's expression softened, pride there, but tempered with respect. He didn't rush toward her. He simply waited, giving her the space to walk on her own. Mara lifted her chin. She crossed the short stretch of concrete toward them, each step steady. She felt the weight of the past at her back, the years she had spent drifting inside a marriage that blurred her edges, the notebooks that had gathered dust in forgotten boxes, the daughter she was only now learning to speak truth with. All those parts were hers. None of them defined her limits. When she reached Caleb, he gave a subtle nod. "You ready?" he asked quietly. She let the question sit for a heartbeat, letting it settle inside her chest. She could feel the old fear flutter. but it no longer dictated her pace. "Yes," she said. "I am—" Caleb opened the door to the briefing room. She stepped inside, tables lined with data reports, screens glowing with maps, projections, warnings, people turning toward her, not with skepticism, but with expectation. They made room for her at the head of the table, a place she had earned long before she ever believed she deserved it. Mara drew in a slow breath. For the first time in decades, she didn't question whether she belonged. This life, the one she once imagined but never claimed, felt close enough to touch. She glanced out the window at the harbor one last time, the light rising over the water, stretching long and bright across the surface. Had she finally stepped into the life she always denied herself? The answer hovered just beyond her grasp, warm and waiting, as she took her seat and prepared to speak. Sometimes, healing begins where we least expect it, in the quiet moment after everything falls apart, when there's finally enough space to hear our own voice again. What Mara learned, and what so many of us learned too late, is that losing a life we outgrew is not the same as losing ourselves. Sometimes the bravest thing we can do is step out of the story someone else wrote for us and remember the parts we left behind, the gifts, the instincts, the strength that never truly disappeared. And sometimes the people we love can only meet us honestly once we stop shrinking to keep the peace. There is no perfect way to start over. There is only the small, steady decision to show up again for our work, our family, our worth, and the quiet parts of ourselves we abandoned along the way. If you're standing at the edge of a new beginning, unsure whether you deserve it, I hope this reminds you you don't have to earn the right to live your own life. You already have it, and sometimes that's enough to take the first step. Thank you for spending a little of your time with this story today. It means more than you know to have you here, listening, feeling, and sharing this quiet space with us. If the story touched you, a simple share or subscribe helps carry these gentle human moments to someone who might need them too. Wishing you peace, warmth, and a soft place to rest your heart tonight.